All right, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this very exciting webinar that Matt Gagan will be putting on for us today. It's called Event-Driven Integration with Reltio, including a look at Reltio with Kafka. So I'm Chris Detzel, and I am a community program manager. As most of you know, you've probably seen me on all these webinars. So I'm excited to continue to have these because you keep coming, you keep asking questions, and my hope is that you learn a ton from these webinars. So here are some of the housekeeping rules. We just want to make sure that you keep yourself on mute during the webinar. Ask your questions in the chat. I'll make sure that they will be asked during the webinar, as we've done several times. The webinar will be recorded and shared out to the Reltio community by, what's today? Maybe tomorrow, but probably next week. We are, and I'm going to continue to say this over and over until I get a volunteer or two, we are looking for others to present on topics that you might be really good at or interested in sharing with the community. I have some times in September and October, so if you're just really wanting to present, would love to have you. So today we do have the webinar around event-driven integration with Reltio, including a look at Reltio with Kafka, which I'm very excited about. And then, as promised, we have another webinar coming up on August 26th that I just booked yesterday or the day before. It's called Survivorship. That's what comes after match, actually. So that one will be really popular. So go to community.reltio.com/events/calendar to sign up for that. I have 2 to 3 other webinars that I'm in the works of building today, but I need to get confirmation on some topics and descriptions and things like that. We'll probably have 1 or 2 more in August, and my goal is to book them up every week in September and October. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to give this over to Matt. Matt?
Thank you, Chris. Let me go ahead and share from my end. Let me know if you can see my my opening slide here. So the topic of today's session is to talk about event-driven integration with Reltio, and there's a very specific kind of focal point here, which is the flavor of the month, it seems, out there in the streaming world is Kafka. And so I'm going to tackle, or try to tackle, the Kafka topic head on. And so let's move forward with this. So our proposed agenda today is to recap, to bring everybody up to a kind of a level with regard to Reltio's overall approach to integration, and then to take a specific focus on event-driven and how Reltio provides support for that, and then dive one level deeper and be specific about how Reltio can interact now and in the future with Kafka. We're going to have a specific time, I would think, at the end for questions, but also if there are questions that come up as we go through all of this, please put them into the chat. Chris will pick up on them and will attempt to interrupt me, and we'll see if we can get those questions answered in the live stream here. So thinking about the integration overview that I was promising there, when we think about Reltio and we start at the heart of this diagram here, Reltio's got its RDM and its MDM layers and capabilities woven out in those modern technologies that many of us are familiar with, but basically a number of multi-model components, including a NoSQL database, an enterprise search capability, and a graph ability to, in an open-ended way, connect data to one another. All of these capabilities are then exposed functionally to an additional open-ended set of layers of functional components that customers would build or leverage Reltio deliverables. So that middle kind of connecting layer is a very, very extensive and adaptive set of REST-based APIs, as well as proactive notifications outbound from Reltio in the form of the streaming APIs. So it's on top of these mechanisms that Reltio delivers functional adaptive capabilities in the form of the user interfaces that you may be familiar with for data stewardship, for business users to be able to work with data, as well as from an administrative self-service point of view to control the platform, configure the platform on an ongoing basis, so as to incrementally develop additional value over time. And then you'll see that we're calling out some very specific connectors that Reltio is making available for frequently seen requirements. So many of our customers need to integrate with Salesforce. Reltio provides a Salesforce connector, but we're not here to talk about the details of that today. Similarly, many of our customers working with B2B data need to enrich their information using Dun & Bradstreet. We provide a connector for those purposes. And then very open-ended, there are abilities to import batches of data from CSV or from structured documents, and conversely, in a very highly controlled way, be able to output CSV and structured documents using the Reltio exporter. So these are Reltio data loader and exporter. But what about everything else? So building this out a little bit further, customers have synchronous needs. So think about this in the context of an engagement application. Maybe it's the loyalty, maybe it's some digital application that customers are using, or a web portal wanting to interact with your organization. Customers are leveraging synchronous mechanisms so that in real time, they can get answers to important questions from Reltio. And they're using tools like we see depicted here, MuleSoft, or other integration platforms that provide these capabilities to put in place an API-led set of services, which on the one hand talk to specific applications that have the answers to those questions, and then on the other side provide reliable, reusable services so that those applications can get the answers that they want in a repeatable, easy to manage way. And so, of course, these components are using different of Reltio's REST APIs to get answers to questions like, who is this customer? What are their consent? What is their preferences? What's an extended kind of profile or a 360-degree look like from Reltio's point of view? And we've covered this in some detail in a previous session, and you'll be able to find recordings as well as a blog post that starts to talk about this API-led approach to integration. What we're here to talk about today, though, is use of Kafka and alternatives in asynchronous communications. So this is more about not get me the burning answer to my question, which is how you would characterize these synchronous integrations, but rather from an asynchronous point of view, it's a case of, here's what just happened. If anybody needs to know about it, they can come to me and find the answer to that question, meaning customers' loyalty points just got updated. Maybe some apps out there need to know that. Customer just changed their address. It would be great if they only had to do that in one place. So here's a place where that up-to-date and approved address can be found so that subscribing systems can come in, take advantage of that, and do that very, very quickly. So Kafka is near real time in its ability to keep applications all on the same page, singing to the same hymn book, if you will. When we think about asynchronous, what is Kafka and these alternative mechanisms? They're just a very, very modern, very, very rapid and more extensible way of doing asynchronous updates. And if you think about the legacy, think 10, 15, 20 years ago, what did this look like? It was batch files. So you would just output a batch file and be very, very asynchronous. Here's everything that didn't just happen. It's happened sometime in the last 24 hours, maybe in the last week. And here's an opportunity for us to take those data and push them proactively in certain directions to make sure that eventually everybody's on the same page. But Kafka represents an opportunity to do things much more quickly. So Reltio customers are using combinations of these two paradigms, these two ways of using Reltio's integration capabilities to solve their important business problems, operational and otherwise. And then from an analytics support point of view, Reltio does provide at least one more collection of capabilities in the form of outbound connectors supporting some Reltio delivered capabilities in the form of Reltio Analytics, Reltio Data Science, but also customers wishing to bring their own Snowflake environments. There's a Snowflake connector that operates in pretty fast batch operations to refresh copies of Reltio data in that environment as well as these others. So it's at this point that we're going to start to jump off, and we'll talk about streaming in general, and then I'll take a specific look at Kafka. So let's look at streaming capabilities and streaming support generally within Reltio. So this diagram at the bottom is really kind of something that we could read from left to right, where inbound, there'll be new data, information coming into Reltio. Reltio is going to do all of its good stuff, generate events, and those events you have an opportunity to place onto a number of different outbound message services. So currently, Reltio supports AWS, SQS, and SNS for the Amazon side of things. In the Google world, we support Google Pub Sub, and for Azure oriented customers, we support Azure Service Bus. So there's a notable gap here. We don't yet support Kafka directly as part of this set of overall prepackaged capabilities, but it is on the Reltio roadmap. What you also see depiction of here is the fact that we do provide some, in that self-service environment that I was talking about, you have available controls, and those controls provide some ability to decide and determine which types of events make it onto these queues and which queues certain of those events actually get directed to from among all of the possible queues that you might have available to you. What you'll also see notably absent here is that we don't see SQS, Google Pub Sub, Azure Service Bus on the left-hand side of this diagram upstream. That's really indicative of the fact that Reltio doesn't have a built-in event consumer. So our support for events is natively just outbound, meaning if you wanted to stream events into Reltio and have Reltio respond accordingly, you're going to need to build or leverage a component that sits and performs the role of a Reltio consumer. So it's going to take from any of those types of queues that we may think of, it's going to have a listener specific to consuming messages over that type of message bus or queue. And it's going to then take the opportunity to package the information that it found up in a form that is compatible with Reltio, and then squirt that information into Reltio so Reltio can be updated and kept in sync with what's going on outside there in the ecosystem, in connected systems. So moving forwards and thinking specifically about Kafka. So without a current Kafka capability, this is what Reltio customers are doing in order to integrate with Kafka, both upstream and downstream. So on the left-hand side, as well as on the right-hand side. So just like we discovered, there in this case would need to be an ability to read from Kafka topics using a Reltio Kafka consumer. And on the outbound side, the information is going to take a hop. We're going to naturally publish whatever it is that the customer wants to see published onto a variety of queues of the type of their choosing. And then there's a need to plug in a Reltio Kafka producer that can take those information and turn them into whatever Kafka native form is required for other systems to be able to consume them and leverage them and be kept on the same page as, in this case, Reltio. Which sounds like a disadvantage, but from an enterprise architecture point of view, there are some opportunities that it does present. And these are, in fact, some things that even if you were only using SQS throughout your ecosystem, you might decide to do. It provides an opportunity for some additional filtering and routing of events to different enterprise queues based on what's coming out of Reltio. So update to customers' addresses, update to customers' loyalty, an update to product information. These may need to go onto different queues, different topics downstream. So you may want a component like this producer sitting there doing that anyway. Also, when Reltio pushes its messages onto these queues, it's going to be in a Reltio canonical form, which may not be exactly what you need it to look like for consumption by all of your different systems across the enterprise. And therefore, there's probably an opportunity or even a need here to take the Reltio form and turn it into that canonical enterprise format that Reltio doesn't fully natively represent. And then in the case of some of these outbound messages, the payloads would be very large if under certain situations and certain types of messages, we were to try to push all the information that you might ever need. And I'm thinking specifically of situations like a merge that takes place between, let's say, two large business records or profiles inside of Reltio. If we were to put what was merged and what it turned into all in one payload, that would probably be too much of an overhead. So there's an opportunity here when Reltio places a message natively onto any of these mechanisms, it's going to say that profile A matched with and merged with profile B. You have an opportunity then to come back in through that front door, get the information that you want using Reltio's APIs in a synchronous way. So you'll ping it and you'll wait for the response and then put the corresponding message onto the appropriate, in this case, Kafka topics, in order that you've got everything that a consumer application is going to need in order to be able to react appropriately and be updated accordingly. So from a demonstration point of view, which is where I'd like for us to go next, I'm going to tell a story where an upstream system produces an event based on the creation or the update of a customer in its own context. And then we're going to have Reltio via a Reltio consumer pick up a message representing that customer and their information, go ahead, ping the Reltio APIs using this Reltio consumer that I've built, and then Reltio will go ahead and update or create a customer as necessary based on the information that it encounters in that payload. And then, of course, having done so, Reltio will respond and push an outbound message stating and representing what this customer looks like, which I'll take and put into a Kafka topic, and then we will see what that message looks like by putting in place a consumer on behalf of, let's say, a downstream system that needs to be kept on the same page as effectively this upstream system and Reltio together. So in this demonstration, then you can really kind of think of this as two flows in one. There's demo part one, there's demo part two. And now when we get to it, what does the demo look like? It's actually, I'm using a terminal on my local machine here. So we're going to see code. I'm going to place some JSON on behalf of this system into a Reltio input Kafka topic. We're then going to see that gets picked up, that it gets turned into a payload to push into Reltio, and then we should see Reltio respond to that with how it's interpreted that payload. And then very shortly afterwards, Reltio is going to place a message onto its own native SQS outbound queue. And I'm going to use this Reltio producer to read that, turn it into a correspondingly more compact Kafka message, push that onto a topic so that we can then finally read that. And then if we wanted to potentially post that into the application that it's operating on behalf of. So that's what the demonstration is going to look like. And it's at this point, I'd ask if there are any questions that we need to deal with at this point, or shall I go ahead and start to show these terminal windows?
Hey, Matt, before you do, we have one question, maybe two. Say when we are planning to process the data from Kafka consumer, and the data has all the columns, but we need only 4 columns and need to be column name needed to be changed per format. Is that possible? Don't know if you got that, but.
Yeah, that's going to be the responsibility of this component here that is consuming from Kafka on behalf of Reltio. So inside of here, you're going to put whatever logic is required that says, I don't care about these other elements of that payload. I just need to focus on these endpoints here and their corresponding values. And then necessarily, I think in almost all cases, you'll be turning that payload into a Reltio specific shape in terms of its JSON so that you can then simply post it into Reltio as an update, and Reltio will do the rest.
Hey, Matt, this is Rob. I have a quick question. Could you go back a couple slides? I think one more. Correct. Yeah, thank you. So in this case, Reltio is all REST API based, and in these two squares, Reltio, Kafka, consumer, and producer. What do you, is that a from your perspective, is that a producer that we would build, or is that a Reltio Kafka producer?
I would say you would build a Reltio Kafka producer. What I should have actually stated, even at the outset of this presentation, is there's a certain color coding going on in all of my schematics here. That blue is Reltio and orange is your own infrastructure, your own stuff. And so the onus then is on you or your partners to put in place, using whatever mechanisms you find most appropriate, the consumer, the producer, whatever it is that you need in order to conform what it is that Reltio natively will be able to do and turn it into what you actually need for downstream consumption. And I probably should have focused on this at the time as well, but when we think about what your options are in deploying these middleware components, effectively that's what they are, you've got a plethora of different choices. You've got your standard kind of integration platforms, things like MuleSoft. MuleSoft itself can listen to Kafka topics and turn those into API calls into Reltio. So there's an opportunity to use that on both sides of this. They can produce, listen to SQS and produce Kafka messages as well. You've got Kafka specific vendors out there like Confluent.io with a whole plethora of different libraries and capabilities that customers can stand up and perform the same. Or when we get to my demonstration very, very shortly, you're going to see that I use JavaScript, and I created a number of just little scripts that I can fire up in my terminal on my Mac here and have them perform these roles of listening and then producing, listening and then producing in these two different cases here.
So from your experience with respect to Kafka, not to pick on the Kafka stuff too much, but what you're showing here is basically going from an existing pub sub topic-based model technology, SQS, SNS, PubSub, Google, Azure, Service Bus, et cetera, that already gives us topic-based durable subscribers, all the sort of features that Kafka has. What's the benefit? What are your customers benefiting from leveraging Kafka like that? Is it because they already have an investment in Kafka and they can just, essentially integrate with that existing footprint, or is there something else that I'm missing?
I think it's a number of things at the same time. I think Kafka is definitely flavor of the month. And I think that there are probably some very good reasons for that. It has open source origins. And so I think that's attractive to organizations. It has capabilities beyond just purely streaming a message and assuming that message is ultimately going to die and not continue to exist. So Kafka, they're very durable if you want them to be topics, and can be even considered to be rich, highly extensible databases. So what that means is at any later date, should you so wish, you'd be able to come back into a Kafka topic and understand and retrieve a message plus all of its additional metadata that you had previously acted on, let's say weeks ago, to reevaluate what it was that you'd consumed, why you consumed it, or even just use it as a database in its own rights. And I know that there are organizations out there, doing that. That's not necessarily my purpose and what I'm trying to convey in the value of Kafka to Reltio customers right now, but I know it beyond Reltio. It's a capability that I think is causing customers to invest in it as a kind of an infrastructure, because they can do so many different things with it. And therefore it's a skill set. It's a set of invested in components that they, with very little additional investment, should be able to leverage directly with their use of Reltio subscription.
Again, Matt, we have a lot of other questions coming in. I'm not going to ask all those questions yet. I want you to go into the demo because, that's kind of the meat of this. So let's keep going. And then whenever you get done with the demo, then I'll start asking more questions. Does that fair?
Hey, Chris, this is Rahul. Can I ask one question? Maybe is that okay? Just
Yeah, go ahead.
one.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes, Matt. So this diagram that you're showing, right? How can you explain how this will work on managed Kafka, say on Azure, or on a managed Kafka on AWS? So are we still going to write those JavaScripts that will pull the data from SQS or Azure Service Bus? So how will that work?
I'm not intimately, thanks for the question. I'm not intimately familiar with exactly what componentry is provided for you in the context of those different managed Kafka environments. So I'm not therefore sure exactly what you will have instead of the JavaScript examples that I'm going to use today to show you. But I think the important point here is there's a lot of flexibility available to you in terms of what you choose to put in place here or here, whether it's part of your managed packaged capabilities, part of a separate investment in an integration technology like MuleSoft, or whether it's something that you want to go ahead and custom build, which of course is what we're going to see in my demonstration today.
Okay, got it.
Great. And I promise to ask those questions here later, but yeah, let's keep going, Matt. Thanks.
All right, thanks. So let's accelerate back to where we were. So we're going to see these kinds of outputs in my terminal windows. And so now I'm going to pivot away and show you what that looks like. First, let's go to terminal. So this should look somewhat like the depiction we just saw. So on the left-hand side, top left here, this is where on behalf of System A, I'm going to post some JSON that should concisely represent a new customer that just got created or updated in the context of System A. What we're going to see on the right, top right, is that message being picked up, and then you'll see the interaction with Reltio in the form of JSON back and forth as it will spew into this window here. Once Reltio's consumed it, dealt with it, Reltio is going to place a message, and we'll see that SQS message represented here, and then we'll see what we turn it into and place it onto the Kafka topic on the outbound side, and then we'll see this window pick up that message, and obviously that's an opportunity then for us to be able to push that into System B, given the kind of context that we're trying to paint in this demo here. So hopefully that all makes sense. Basically, the data is going to come across here, do a U-turn, and come back in the direction more or less that it came from. And the bridge between each of these two windows is a Kafka topic. This one is inbound, this one is outbound. So let's go and get some data to put into this top window here. So I'm going to go into my line of code here. This is JSON, and it represents that there's a source called loyalty that's got a new ID representing a new customer with a phone number, with an email address, and then with a few address components, address line 1, city, and state. And I'm simply going to copy that JSON and go back to my terminal and paste that into this window here. When I hit return, that's when it's going to actually launch it onto the Reltio input topic. And you see the message got picked up. This is the inbound payload to Reltio, and this is Reltio responding with what it just created in its world. And then here on the bottom, we'll see a message get posted into SQS, and you saw a quick response there. And this is already updated on this outbound Kafka topic. So I don't know if you picked up on the details there, but there was the address is 6116 Durbin Road. I remember seeing that in what I pasted here. So this data has all done a full round trip and made it quite quickly to System B from System A, which is what we're really trying to say here. And if I change gears and take a look at Reltio, the actual Reltio environment that we just posted these data into, let's come back over here, refresh the dashboard in this Reltio demo tenant here. And what we can see is that Robert Graham was created. This was our target record just now with this timestamp. And if I go into this profile to look in some more detail, we'll see that the fragments of data, like the mobile number, have gone through a cleansing and standardization process. The address, similarly, has been verified. The zip +4 has been generated, plus some metadata indicating important information, plus latitude, longitude. And then if I expand this structured attribute for email, we can see that this appears to be in a valid format at a private domain, this fictional domain here. So this is the representation of the customer in the Reltio side, and all of that code that we saw in those various windows just now were really all of the mechanics of the exchange of information to and from Reltio, and then pushing that inbound or outbound on those Kafka topics. So hopefully that kind of illustrates the speed, the responsiveness, and using, in my case, some custom JavaScript to empower these various perspectives here. Really, actually, just this one here and this one here. I was using Node.js as an available JavaScript technology to put in place these two mechanisms. And so if I switch back to the slide deck we were operating from here, I guess this is the point where that pretty much is everything that I was proposing to demonstrate. The rest is, I could put more data in there. We'd see some different reactions, different responses. I saw that there was actually a potential match that was generated for the record that we just created, which I didn't dwell on, but this is all Reltio good stuff that I expect most of us understand.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I'm going to go ahead and start asking the questions, since we have a slide right for it. So do you know the timeline? What is the timeline of the Kafka connector on Reltio's roadmap?
There isn't a timeline that I can currently share. So I was talking to product leadership last night, and we're still not in a position to concretely say exactly when that's going to be.
Okay. Is Reltio planning to address the challenges in current architecture via proposed Kafka connector?
I guess we'd need to get into the details of what are considered to be a challenge in this case.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do we have any limit to read records from Kafka topic?
So it's an interesting question, of course, because Reltio, in any API call that you make inbound, which I think is what the context is for the question here, will invite you to take advantage of the performance benefits of packaging up a lot of proposed updates to customer data and bundling them into a single API call. So we like to think that the sweet spot, at least in batch scenarios, is about 100 profiles at a time that could be updated, and of course massively in parallel with Reltio. When we constrain ourselves to simply operating purely based on a sense and respond detection of a Kafka message, now we're missing an opportunity there, and we're creating more API calls, but it would be driven by the use cases that you're looking to support. And by that, I mean, if getting the information in Reltio and therefore out of the back door as quickly as possible is the objective, to service some real burning use cases, that means Reltio needs to be on the same page as some upstream application, and Kafka is going to be the mechanism we choose to make that happen, then that's the cost of doing it, and we would say that's fine, and there's not going to be any limit that I know of. Reltio's APIs are designed to scale to massive numbers of inbound posts, which of course is what this infers, in a very, very short time frame. So I don't know what the saturation should look like, but based on your use cases, Reltio has been designed to scale. So it's about letting us know, making us understand what that looks like, and then we can scale accordingly in the context of your specific Reltio environment to make sure that we're there for you and we can meet those expectations.
Great, and they're pouring in, Matt. So if the input event has both master and transactional info, will Kafka separate that, the use of JSON builder to create the right JSON?
So this again sounds like it's an inbound opportunity and context that we're talking about. Since we're talking about custom building a Reltio consumer, then that Reltio consumer, as it interprets each message, can be built in a way that interprets part of it as master data, any other part of it as contextual or transactional, or what we like to call in Reltio interaction data. And by splitting those into two, you can decide which bits you want to use right now, which bits you might discard, or where you need those data to go in Reltio. So the master data represents a master data update to a profile in Reltio. We'll post that through that API call. And then separately, we'll be posting the transaction as an additional record in Reltio's interactions that will be joined to that particular profile.
Okay. So another question, how would you synchronize out of order time series data? So say interactions or a series of changes for the same customer originating from multiple input systems coming to Kafka, then consumer, then Reltio.
So that sounds like on the inbound side as well. You're going to want to use the timestamps as a mechanism that you would put into the payloads that represent when, in the context of those upstream contributions, we should represent the information as being known and being factual, so that as you seek to interpret those in the context of your Reltio consumer, you've got an opportunity to reorganize and decide in what sequence you'd want to push them into Reltio. But that itself implies somewhat buffering of the data, because you're going to want to wait for short time frames, short periods of time, until all information that you think might need to be available is available, so that you can do that slight reorder and then decide what to push into Reltio.
And then Stephen has a question. Is the intent with the roadmap to replace the first hop, so Azure, Pub, Sub, SNS with Kafka directly? And if so, when will it be available?
Excuse me. The information available to me right now is that the intention is to bring into the mix Kafka up to the same level of capability that we currently provide for the SQS, the Google Pub Sub, and the Azure Service Bus, meaning whatever controls are available to you right now for those mechanisms will be on feature parity with our outbound support for Kafka as a native output mechanism as well.
Great. So another question, can we aggregate the events Reltio creates in SQS? So merge of entities, sends out, create, change events, that kind of stuff? So,
I know that this is definitely a challenge for customers right now, because there isn't really a kind of a FIFO, a first in, first out necessarily available mechanism in the context of something like SQS, which means that as you pick those messages up, you may receive them out of sequence. And so this on the outbound side for Reltio sounds like a very similar problem to the one that we were just talking about the solution to on the inbound side, and really requires that, again, that you're going to buffer for a short period of time until you understand everything you think you need to know before you send those information wherever they need to go next beyond Reltio.
Might just comment on this and a question, if I may. It's Dmitry on the FIFO. So it's not just about SQS, right? Because the events themselves on the platform level, as they are generated asynchronously, and that's due to scalable nature of the platform, because events are being processed by multiple nodes in parallel at the same time. But you can use Kafka specifically. Once you stream from SQS to Kafka, you can create a producer that will aggregate, and you can put a storage key, use timestamp that every event has as a storage key to sort aggregated values, and you can aggregate everything for last 5 seconds, for example, and this way sort them in Kafka, and as a result get it sorted, right?
No, that's a great point, and I oversimplified my response there, but you're absolutely right. And So yeah, I mean, Reltio is an asynchronous platform. There is no guarantee that any particular event is going to complete in advance of any other, given the distributed nature of the way those components work internally. But that's a great solution also that you proposed there, to leverage those timestamps, which will be down to the millisecond level in terms of their detail.
And Dimitri, quick question, Srikanth here. Would we be able to do this on SQS, the aggregation on the SQS itself, or as Kafka provides that ability and SQS does not have today?
Yes, you're right. Kafka has this capability and SQS does not have this capability today, so we have to use Kafka for that.
Because we are struggling with that, right? Like when a merge happens on an entity, Reltio throws out 15 different events. If the merge could happen between 3 or 4 orgs, organizations, and the 15 events, pushing them all the way to the system back is just too much traffic. So we want to kind of aggregate and then pass one single message, giving them a view of what happened, what exactly happened. So
yes, and and this is very, very common question from our customers and partners, and sometimes there is a perception that using FIFO, first in, first out, is a solution here, but you need to realize that platform will input the first in, not guaranteed that it's really first. So you have to after the queue, you have to sort by timestamp. And Kafka is the best solution right now. There are best practice I found in things like Stack Overflow, specifically for Kafka, how to create a producer that aggregates and sorts by timestamp. So that's a very known use case for Kafka, and I would suggest to use that, yes.
So in fact, it sounds like another opportunity missing from my original list that suggests that even if with our native support for things like SQS right now, that a customer may wish pragmatically to use Kafka as the downstream mechanism, because now your producer that is hopping the data from one mechanism to the other can leverage exactly what it is that Dimitri is explaining to us here.
But that's good, Matt, because that gives some room for my webinar in August.
Excellent. And if it wasn't obvious to everybody, Dimitri is one of our engineers here at Reltio, a senior member of our staff here on the engineering side.
Dimitri, would you be able to share like some more details on if there are? I mean, we don't want to bring in a new component now, Kafka in particular, because our solution is almost kind of getting into a prod state. Would you be able to share some more details on what would be our other options to kind of reduce the traffic coming out without Kafka? Maybe not in this call, but
yeah, and you know what? That's actually a good question to post on the community. So if you go to community.reltio.com, post that, and I'll have Dimitri and or both Dimitri and Matt answer that. If you do that, I'll make sure that it gets answered.
We'll do that.
So by the way, we have a few more questions, so keep pushing them in, but I do like feedback, and I share all feedback on as I get it, especially if you put it in the chat. I can show people, hey, this is really good, or these. So please post your feedback, in the chat as we kind of keep going. So Matt, any use case guidelines for what events to capture and how to support timing of separate events for specific entities and also separate but related domains? So any aggregation approaches to reduce traffic?
I'm not sure that I fully understand that question.
Mark, let's see if Mark can open up.
Yeah, hi. It kind of ties in a little bit of what Srikanth was asking. Is we're struggling with the events. We're struggling with applications that are kind of having dependencies on, let's say, an organization and a contact with a relationship there, and trying to get things back into a business transaction from the events is really what we're getting at. So the idea of aggregating them, kind of polling them, that's really the answer. That's where we're struggling, and there doesn't seem to be really anything out there to give us any kind of guidelines or use cases with this.
Is this Mark? Is this on the outbound side?
Yeah, it's totally on the outbound side. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Totally on the outbound side, yes.
Yeah. Right. So, we're we've been struggling to figure out which events to go. We think we're kind of there, okay, but it's and it really is kind of what you were you were just talking about earlier with TreeCon. To get them in the right sequence, to try to get this in their real-time mode, and also to reduce the traffic of the applications, because as things get remastered, if we're in coexistence mode, there can be a lot of shuffling that has to happen, on the apps that are, getting the events, which were actually the source to begin with. And we just want to try to minimize the chatter and churning, because it is
Right.
expensive.
In addition to using a mechanism like Dimitri was explaining before that, to some extent buffers and allows an opportunity to reorder, correctly order, I should say, how you will then going to be able to interpret those. The only other thing I can think of that can potentially help here is leveraging the APIs rather than simply listening to the event stream and trying to work out what's noise and what's out of sequence. Meaning, when I see an event that I do choose to allow through using my available controls, and I detect that something material has happened to a profile that I should care about, that I use the APIs to come back in and get the representation of that object in whatever ways I'm concerned about, whether it's relationships or whether it's the object itself, so that I can take that, package that up and send it where it needs to go. So rather seeing the event stream as a trigger, rather than necessarily as the place to get the answers to all of the questions. It sounds like there's potentially a different way of thinking about how to use the event stream.
And again, I don't want to get into too much detail in this course. It's not fear people necessarily, they're not interested in this. But we really, really are struggling. We'll post something in the community. If there's any kind of follow-up that we can get, it would really, really be helpful.
Hey, Mark, and I like that idea. I am the community manager, but post that in the community and your questions on that, and we can see how much follow-up we can push out. Certainly, we can answer some of those questions just by a reply, but there might be some more opportunity that we can help you out even more, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, that would be terrific, because I think we'll
yeah, just go to community.reltio.com, post. Remember, your first post is going to be moderated, but I'll go approve it, and then we'll have somebody answer that. And more specifically, most likely, it'll be Matt or somebody else. So I really do appreciate that. So another question, Matt, and this is kind of like a ask me anything. It's like you present a little bit of stuff, and we get a lot of good questions. So it says,
I should have presented much more, and then less time for questions.
I love the questions though. It's my favorite part actually. Can I use Reltio API call to retrieve a party ID golden record based on any source party ID which belongs to this party? Party all around.
Yes. So there's an API call that you can make in Reltio that we call get by crosswalk. And in Reltio, the crosswalk really is the combination of source plus unique key in the context of that source. So when you do that, you'll be using the crosswalk as the mechanism through which to identify the overall profile, as consolidated as that may be in Reltio. And of course, that payload, you're then in control of what comes back to you. Is it all of the other crosswalks? So I get all of that correlated knowledge. Which attributes do I want to see as part of that payload being returned to me as well? So yes is the answer.
Yeah, I like that. It was quick and easy. Nothing's really easy, right? Another question. So challenges like support. So one, advanced filters, ability, modify Reltio, default payload. I don't know if that's a question, but that sounds like a challenge that Deepak is having. And then Sandro asks, isn't outbound APIs from Reltio to pub sub constrained by a limit of 300 records? I'm guessing the Reltio consumer would need to incorporate pagination for those use cases. Is that the case? Or?
I don't know of any limits on the outbound streaming side of things. The limits that I am aware of are specific to what queue mechanisms or streaming mechanisms you're using. There are limits to payload size, and I'm thinking about difficulties customers have encountered with very large consolidated records in Reltio needing to be posted in their entirety onto an SQS queue. And the size of the message is prohibitively running into the limit of SQS, and therefore you've got a message that doesn't really have the integrity. So for those reasons, upstream in your control center, you do have the ability to configure what happens in those scenarios, and that I believe can also now be conditional on the payload size. So not a one size fits all, don't publish anything onto the queue, just the entity ID, versus, okay, publish it if it fits, else hold it back.
Okay.
But that's, stepping back into the actual question that was asked, in terms of numbers of records that can be posted onto these mechanisms, I'm not aware of a limitation.
That's a big deal.
I can add to that real quick if you have 1 minute. Yeah, thank you, Chris. So just so you know, for that, in the current release we are working on, which will be available later in October this year, we add some additional capabilities which will make your workflow with queues, recommended workflow with queues like this. You can stream events with payload into the outbound queue. Our statistics says that for most of our customers, absolute number of events will fit through will fit the size of limitation of the SQS, which is 256 kilobyte, if I remember correctly. But we added additional flag. So basically, if you just listen to the messages from the queue and listen all of them and you stream all of them, but if for some reason there was a single event that was too big to go through the queue, you will still receive it without actual payload, but with the flag, telling you that this event was too big to go through the queue. So you will have to do one additional get call through the API to get this specific payload through the API. And you can work this manner. You will receive 99.9% of your messages with payload normally. And in case there was something too big, you'll just do an additional get call and get that.
Is the get call for the entity, or is the get call for what would have been in the event?
For the entity. And some additional functionality. I'm going to talk about additional functionality here a bit, but it will be available as well in this release. We'll be streaming payload of Delta only. So only things that changed in the entity will be streamed as a payload in the same manner as activity log is structured today. So same type of JSON. It'll be documented. It's something we're working on right now, and I think I'll be able to talk more about this later in August. But anyways, just so you're aware where we are moving with this.
That's excellent, Dimitri. Thank you. And just to recap, I believe you stated that that's a future capability that's going to be in the next release due in October of Reltio. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
So another question, what kind of monitoring reporting is available for events published, consumed?
So as part of your Reltio console, tenant management capability available via that application, you do have the ability to monitor your various queues. So you can see queue sizes, queue rates.
Okay, good. As of now, so we have just about 5 or 6 minutes left. One, I would say, please add, was this helpful? Did you like it? What kind of webinars would you like to look at in the future? Chetan mentioned maybe a webinar of match score based on comparator or match rules. So that's a good one. But I'm always open for ideas. And then, someone who's like, hey, I just want a good webinar around just, let's get on the phone and just talk about, Reltio in general. So maybe we could do like a list of experts, right? Like 4 or 5 people like you, Matt, and Dimitri, and some others, right? And so people just start asking us a bunch of questions about certain things, that could be kind of fun. But as of now, if there are no questions, I am gonna webinar advance about advanced survivorship. We do have one coming up on survivorship in August. So, let's come to that. And if there's specific, Gene, if there's more things that you want to talk more about survivorship, then we can also go more in depth. Joel is going to do that one as well. So that's April 26th, I believe. So if you go to community.reltio.com and click on the events and upcoming events, you'll see that. But I like those. So definitely survivorship is one we're covering. If there are no questions, please post quickly in the chat. Let us know how you liked it. 2 is I did post something there. If you want to rate and review us, Reltio, on Gartner's Gartner's deal, click on the link in the chat, and we'll send you a little goodie. Just send me a view of, hey, I took it. You don't have to show me your score or what you rated us, but I'll make sure to get something sent out to you. So thank you everyone for coming.